You ready, Will?
Let's do this.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of our Armchair Adventure Book Club. We're so excited to have you here. And this week's guest is Will Harlan, the author of Untamed, which I have here. And this has been one of my absolute favorite books. I read it when it first came out years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, probably now. Is that right, Will? 5?
Right. Yep. 2014.
Okay. And I remember it was the first book after I had my daughter that I couldn't put down. She was just a little baby and I was sleep deprived, but I stayed up all night reading this. And one of the reasons it is just so special is because it includes this incredible story of a woman named Carroll, who will tell us more about, but it also shares a lot of history about a really special place in the Southeast that I've never visited, but now really want to go to, and that is Cumberland Island. And then it also weaves in a lot of topics of conservation, especially in regards to sea turtles and ocean conservation. So all of that combined in this book to make it a really captivating read. And for the folks who have not read Untamed yet, Will, I was hoping you could tell them a little bit about maybe what makes Cumberland Island such a special place.
Sure. I went to Cumberland for the first time. I went to school in Atlanta, went to college there, and went to Cumberland just for the summer. I was looking for just a summer break before I started working, and I just fell in love with the place. Just giant dunes and these ancient old growth maritime forests, these live oak, twisted, gnarled trees, and this windswept beach, completely undeveloped, this pristine seashore. And I was just enchanted. So that was the first hook. And then even before I got to Cumberland, I was hearing these rumors on the ferry ride over, because there's no bridge to Cumberland Island. You have to take a boat to get there. And people were talking about this wicked witch of the wilderness, this woman who ate roadkill and rode wild horses bareback down the beach. And I was intrigued and a little bit nervous about meeting her, but I heard about Carroll even before I got to the island. And so the confluence of this magical, beautiful place and this incredibly complex, colorful, complicated, controversial woman really just made it an amazing summer. And I've spent the past 20 years following in Carroll's footsteps and returning to the island every chance I get.
And how did you meet Carroll? And did you know who she was when you first met her after hearing all those rumors about her?
Yeah, so I was just a seasonal park ranger that summer, and my boss had said, stay away from Carroll. I'd heard all these rumors about her, and I was a little nervous. I mean, there were whispers about how she had roadkill breath because she ate dead things from the beach or on the sandy roads, that she, rode buck naked on a wild horse, carrying a bottle of Jack Daniels in one hand and firing a pistol in the other. And then there was always these kind of whispered murmurs of she shot and killed a man. And that was true also. And so I was a little nervous about meeting her, but one day I was just doing my beach patrol, and there she was, carving up a dead sea turtle, autopsying a loggerhead sea turtle that had washed ashore. So she had a bloody, rusty knife in her hand, and she said, hey, come on over. And I was a little nervous because of the rumors I'd heard, but she was not this reclusive hermit that I had expected, or this wicked witch. She was incredibly funny and warm and charming, and she actually said, here, hold this, and she handed me a pile of intestines, and she sliced them open with her knife, and this goop spilled out onto the beach. But what she was doing was not just autopsying this dead sea turtle, but really solving a murder mystery that had been going on for decades, a endangered species murder mystery. And she was the only detective on the case, and she really solved it and changed the way we manage sea turtles and endangered species across the Southeast, across the country.
Yeah, in your book, I learned that sea turtles are one of the most endangered ocean animals, and that 5 of the 7, all sea turtles are endangered, I believe, and that 5 of the 7 breed in the southeastern United States. Like, this is one of the most important sea turtle breeding grounds in the world. And what are some of the things you learned about sea turtle and sea turtle conservation through this project and through getting to know Carroll?
Yeah, so I dedicated the book to Coretta, and when my wife saw that, she was a little concerned. She's like, "Who's this Coretta woman? I didn't know there was another female in your life." But Coretta is actually the scientific name for the loggerhead sea turtle, which I think is such a beautiful uh, Latin binomial for this endangered species. But loggerheads are one of the 5 uh, sea turtles that nest on Cumberland, and this is the second largest. The Southeast United States is the second largest loggerhead sea turtle nesting site in the world. So they really depend on Georgia and Florida for their survival. And so I was a trail runner. Jennifer, you're obviously an accomplished trail. So it's not surprising that you could relate to this book, because it is about some badass people, and the species is also incredibly inspiring to me, because the loggerhead sea turtle and all sea turtles make these incredible ocean journeys. In the loggerhead's case, it travels 10,000 miles from when it's born on Cumberland Island. It's a little, quarter-sized hatchling that scampers out into the ocean. It swims nonstop for 5 days without eating until it can hide in the Sargasso Sea, where there's a whole bunch of seaweed that it can take shelter in. And it spends the next 10 to 20 years swimming all the way to Africa, a 5,000-mile journey. And then when it's ready to breed, it comes amazingly back to the very same beach where it was born. So the sea turtles that are being born this summer on Cumberland will return here 30 years later. And that's an amazing navigational accomplishment, but also just this really amazing journey that these turtles make to come back to their home beach. Just knocked me off my feet. And I've just always been amazed by that journey. And so that's one reason I wanted to write this book, is to celebrate the turtles that Carroll's been helping to protect for the past 4 decades.
Yeah, I thought that was a really touching part of the book, and just a testament to the longevity of Carroll's dedication and research, that she has now started to help the next generation of sea turtles. Like, she would have helped the parents, and now 30 years later, she was helping their children who had gone to Africa and back in 30 years. So the journey of the sea turtle is just, they're such resilient creatures, and it aligns so well with Carroll's personality, because she also, just as a figure, had been through so much hardship. And it's hard to even know where to start with that. But I guess I was struck the whole book by the fact that she was tough. Like, Carroll was just, she went to battle against so many people, the National Park Service, lovers, politicians. And what do you think made her so tough and so resilient and gritty?
It's a great question. The first third of the book is about Carroll's early childhood and adolescence. And initially the publishers were like, maybe we shouldn't include that. Let's just get to the exciting parts about Carroll on the island. And I really felt strongly that people needed to know how she got to where she is, like what made Carroll the person she is today. And so I really think her childhood was really formative. She had parents, she was an only child growing up in the 40s and 50s, mostly in Atlanta, before it became giant suburban sprawl Atlanta. She lived next to the Chattahoochee River when it was still relatively wild, and she didn't have a lot of friends. I think from an early age, she sought friendship in nature, in wild creatures, because she felt different from the other kids. And she was brilliant from an early age, but she loved the natural world. And in the 50s, women were not encouraged to walk around barefoot in creeks looking for salamanders and turtles. So her mom got it, but her dad didn't know what to do with this girl. You know, tomboys were not as welcomed in the 50s as they are today, and Carroll was a tomboy, and I think he taught her a lot of important skills. At one point, he was a hunter, and at one point he had her hold up a quarter, and he stood 50 yards away and shot the quarter out of her hand. So she learned from an early age this kind of maybe this macho bravado kind of outdoorsy from her father. She got some of that, but she also developed an independence because she didn't have peers that she could relate to. Her parents were kind of distant, so she had to find solace in the wild. And so she had a dog that she took to the river every day. And finally, her final summer in Atlanta, she lived in a cave beside the Chattahoochee River because that's where she felt most at home. And I think that early childhood and adolescence of just growing up independent and looking for answers herself really developed her into the person that she is today.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that maybe your publisher pushed back on her childhood and said it wasn't as exciting as her time on the island, because that part really struck me, that like her father, one of the ways that they would spend time together, because he was a gun aficionado, was to go out with his guns. And when she had to hold up the quarter 50 yards away and he shot a quarter out of his daughter's hand, that on top of the fact that like she was included in family happy hours and hard drinks at age 12. And one night at a party, accidentally, her father shot her with a gun that he didn't know was loaded in her abdomen. And most people would consider her childhood today to have been abusive. And yet she maintained, it seemed like, a pretty close relationship with her parents throughout her lifetime. So
That's right.
is that accurate? Was she close to her parents? Did she have any resentment about the way that she was brought up?
You know, she did remain close to her parents. I think as an adult, she became closer to them than perhaps she was younger, because I think she finally gained the confidence to stand on her own and see them more as peers and friends and not as parents so much. But I will say that they loved her and they stepped up for her in the moments that mattered most. I think they didn't know how to relate to her. I think social norms were different and they just didn't know what to do with this crazy, wild girl that was bringing home giant turtles and putting them in their bathtub and but in the end, she stood by them and they stood by her. And there were some really critical moments on the island where she was fearful for her life, and they stepped up in those moments. So, and she wrote to them every week. There was no internet. She had no phone. So she wrote them letters. And I was really lucky as a writer. Carroll shared everything with me. Every letter she wrote to her family or to friends, her journals, her diaries, her field notebooks. So I had a treasure trove of really, she's a data-driven scientist who saves everything. And so as a writer, that's a great gift to have in trying to reconstruct a past that I wasn't there for.
Yeah, and that was clear. It was clear you had so much good content and so many quotes when you were writing the book. And before we sort of move on from Carroll's younger years, which I do want to point out too, in her younger years, in her 20s, she was, as you referenced, responsible for helping to protect the Chattooga and the Chattahoochee. And then she went on to help protect Cumberland. So she's made a huge impact in conservation in the state of Georgia. And she had all these really difficult relationships. Like her relationships just were not what we think of average or normal, with her parents, and then also with her spouses, lovers, partners. And the most notable or standout one is when she was in an abusive relationship on an island with a man who was threatening to kill her. And as he was trying to attack her one time, she fought back in self-defense and shot him and killed him, which is part of the book. But it's interesting, when I read through it, the guy who she was with, who like really got under my skin, was her college professor, because she never graduated college and she was just taking some classes. And one of her professors, it seemed like, realized her brilliance, fell in love with her, convinced her to drop out of school and help him with his research and cook his dinner and do his laundry. And it just was, yeah, it seemed like a lot of Carroll's romantic relationships held her back, yet also defined her. So I wondered if you could talk to that aspect of who she is as a person and how it made her who she is as far as a conservationist.
Yes, great questions. I think Carroll prides herself on being a self-reliant, independent woman, but she's still a human being that needs love and sought out companionship throughout her whole life. And she tried at first to fit in. In the 50s, she got kicked out of college on her first try because she violated curfew. Back then at University of Georgia, if you were out past 10 o'clock and you were a female, you were out. And that's what happened. And so she was on her own in Atlanta. She couldn't live with her parents, got kicked out of Georgia. And so she started working on her own at a radio shop and tried being a domestic housewife first for this guy, and that didn't work out. And then went back to school at Georgia State. And as you said, the professors there immediately recognized her brilliance because she had so much more field work and field experience from her childhood than most PhD professors had at the time. And so she was one semester away from graduating when her biology professor, who was a brilliant biologist, he's since passed away, but Charles Wharton has published books and is one of the most renowned Georgia biologists. But he was also a product of his day, and that doesn't excuse his behavior at all. But he saw Carroll, in very conventional terms, as a female who needed to do domestic work and stay at home. And even though she was a brilliant biologist, she was his assistant. And she played along with that for a while until he cheated on her. And she finally realized that this just wasn't who she was. And that's when she broke ties not only with him, but really with the mainland. And she headed straight for Cumberland and spent the next 40 years of her life carving out her own path there. And for a while was just like, no men, just, I'm done with guys. I just want to do my thing here on the island. So that was a pivotal moment for her.
Yeah, it was interesting because so many of her early relationships, you felt like she compromised too much and lost a part of herself. And yet then she went back to claim it as a conservationist in this uncompromising way, which I think is what led to her reputation on Cumberland, sometimes a negative reputation of like being uncompromising in her stance of conservation. And clearly in the book, you wrote about how she ruffled feathers with the local islanders, the National Park Service, other conservationists. So what do you think made her such a, staunch conservationist when it came to ocean life and sea turtles in Cumberland? And do you agree with how she fought the good fight for conservation? Or do you think she could have been more diplomatic about it?
More great questions. Yes. So Carroll is and remains a very passionate, committed defender of wild creatures, first and foremost, and their habitats. And I think that's partly because she's always been an underdog herself, and she's always fought for the people and the critters that don't have a voice. And when she got to Cumberland, she realized that this island, and especially the sea turtles, didn't have a voice, and they were being slaughtered. In the 1970s, the Endangered Species Act had just been passed. Dead sea turtles were washing ashore by the hundreds, and no one was doing it. Was just normal. People just considered that normal, the way you might think it's normal to see a squirrel on the side of the road. But to her, that was appalling, and she was going to do something about it. And so she has spent 40 years studying one species, which is unheard of in biology today. People jump from one topic to another. Once they get their paper published, it's on to the next. But Carroll has single-mindedly devoted herself to one species and then one island. She has cataloged every species on Cumberland Island. And I think her strategy has been, if I can do my part for this one island, maybe other people will do their part in their backyards. And I think she wants to serve it as an example in that way. But she is uncompromising in her defense of wild creatures and wild places, because they're under assault. And if we don't act now, I mean, we're losing half of our species by the end of this century. She sees things in geologic time, not necessarily in human parameters. And I think because she spent so much time in the wild, she has a lens that maybe we as modern, urban, suburban folks can't quite fully grasp. But she is uncompromising in her defense of wild creatures, because who else will be these days? She feels like there are not enough voices for sea turtles and wild creatures. Is she uncompromising? Yes. Does that sometimes cause friction? Absolutely. Could she have been more diplomatic? Definitely. And even she will admit that she made some mistakes with personal relationships. And that's where conservation gets tricky. Is today, conservation is still about people. It would be great if all you could do is just publish the data about sea turtles and people would instantly respond to the data in an objective way and make the necessary changes. But sadly, even with the data, conservation is often a very political and person-to-person oriented field. And that's where she's gotten tangled up. Her data is rock solid. Her research is unquestionable, but that doesn't always translate into the policies that she wants. And because of her uncompromising nature, it's led to some personal conflicts that maybe could have been avoided.
I thought, one of the sort of underlying conflicts in the book that really, it doesn't have so much to do with Carroll. It's an American conflict these days where we love our national parks and we love access. And you and I, Will, are both outdoor recreationalists and hikers and runners. And I read about these places in Cumberland and I'm like, I want to see it. And part of the tension in this book is that wilderness, in some places, a wilderness designation restricts access or makes it more challenging or makes it unequal. Not everyone can get to places that don't have roads or boardwalks. And so I really, during the book, while I was reading it, was just questioning the value of engagement and exposure, because so much of conservation is letting people experience these beautiful places in their natural state, and then yet also creating healthy boundaries so that our wild places can recover and be more untouched by humans and human impact and influence. So what were your thoughts while you were writing the book? Or maybe you could talk about, Carroll's perspective of wilderness versus public access, but how do you deal with that tension in your mind as a writer and a friend of Carroll's?
You're absolutely right. Cumberland is a microcosm of conflicts and tensions in just about every public land across the country and increasingly across the world. And in this case, you have an island, so you can almost study it on its own. And I'll say up front, Carroll wants you to visit Cumberland. Even though she is a passionate wilderness advocate, wilderness doesn't exclude people at all, but it just limits and forces us to be more humble in how we interact with the landscape. But it absolutely welcomes human participation in the landscape. And Carroll wants you to fall in love with the island. In fact, I'll say this, this book took 19 years to write. The first 10 years, I wasn't thinking about a book. I was just learning everything I could from Carroll. And then some policies got passed which undercut the protection of the island, and things were looking pretty grim for Cumberland. And I realized that Carroll's story needed to be told, and I proposed it to Carroll, and she's got some skeletons in her closet, which we can talk about. But finally she said, okay, fine, I will prostitute myself for the island. I will whore myself out for the wilderness. So how she sees the book is prostitution, but basically her story, she hopes, will inspire readers to care about more places like Cumberland and hopefully be a voice in protecting them. But you can't do that often unless you experience those places. And so she wants you to experience Cumberland. And equally important, she wants you to fight for the mountains in your backyard or wherever you live, that the landscapes, they don't have to be wilderness. They can be, a patch of woods behind your subdivision, whatever it is. We need every scrap of wildlands that we have left. And that's really how Carroll sees it, is the human species has touched and shaped 99.9% of this planet. Can we save the last scraps for wild creatures? It's so heavily tilted in our favor that she feels like wild creatures deserve those last places, these last wild islands like Cumberland, and the last few wilderness areas that truly remain in this world. She thinks we should be able to set aside those as a gesture to the millions of years of evolution that we have that have shaped them, that we have co-evolved with them, that these creatures are part of our legacy, and at the very least we should give them 1% of the landscape that remains.
Yeah, you get that in the book, and you get how important it is to protect these natural environments for wild animals. But I also love the point that's made in the book by Carroll that we need Mother Nature a lot more than she needs us. And at the end of the day, and I think this was a Rachel Carson quote in the book, but we are a part of nature, and our fight for nature to protect our natural environment is also a fight for humanity, which leads me to another reason that this book is so powerful. Is I know growing up, when I in school heard about conservationist, typically it was John Muir or Thoreau or Emerson. In school, I didn't learn about Rachel Carson, who now I feel like hopefully a lot of people know who Rachel Carson is. But the conservation movement in the United States was very male dominant, and also took place a lot of times you hear about out west or even New England. And being a woman from the Southeast, I just was so grateful how this story featured a strong woman in the Southeast and highlighted some of our natural resources in this region. But you were so, it feels like, focused as an author and highlighting not only the strong women on Cumberland Island, but also there were a couple pages that listed maybe about 20 female naturalists of the 20th, 21st century, including Rachel Carson and Jane Goodall, and then a lot that I had not heard about. And so what made you, as a guy, as a dude, what made you want to really pull out and highlight some of these female leaders in conservation?
Absolutely. She's called the Jane Goodall of sea turtles, but you're absolutely right to point out that science remains a very male-dominated field. I think it's evolving, but I really believe that had Carroll been born 3 decades later, she would have been the Jane Goodall. Maybe we would be calling people the Carroll Ruckdeschel of their species. I think she and many other scientists have not been recognized, mainly because they're female. I think Carroll, as you pointed out, she missed earning her college degree by a semester because of a man, and that limited her access to publication, to the scientific community, even though she would go to sea turtle conferences and know more than anyone in the room. And she ended up marrying a PhD biologist who acknowledged that my wife knows a hell of a lot more about sea turtles and about even the subjects that I study than I do. So she is brilliant and but under-recognized, and I think largely because she was a woman who lacked a PhD degree and the pedigree that is expected, I think, in academia. She broke the mold. She didn't dress like they did. She didn't act like they did. She spent her time in the field instead of being a swivel chair biologist, typing away at her computer. She was actually immersed in her subject. So, and had the data to back it up. So all of that makes me believe that not just as a biologist, but also as a conservationist, I think the Park Service and everyone involved in the conservation discussions around Cumberland Island and beyond undervalued Carroll until she asserted herself not just as a woman, but just as an uncompromising figure that was going to fight for Cumberland no matter what. It took extra effort for Carroll to be recognized because of her being a woman at the time.
I also love though how at one point it seems like her lack of pedigree and position is also her superpower. At one point she says scientists never scream, and she's directing that at her PhD husband, but she had nothing to lose. Like, she didn't have a job, she didn't have tenure, she didn't have this esteem in academia that she was worried about losing. Like, she just spoke her heart and mind without fear of losing a position, losing praise. And a big part of her story, and in my mind, what makes her very powerful is she identified very early on that I think I'm going to misquote it a little bit, but she said, the only way I can be wild and free is to not depend on money. And I think a big leaning of hers towards, living in harmony with nature and feeling free was to remove herself from the typical US economy, which feels so hard to do. So maybe you could speak to sort of her take on a dependence on money versus a dependence on our natural resources and nature.
Yeah, two great points there. First, she did have the freedom to speak her mind because she wasn't beholden to, a conventional job. But speaking her mind did cost her. It cost her dearly, and it cost her in relationships. It cost her in. Still to this day on the island, she's reviled. She's despised by many of her neighbors because she has spoken out so passionately and strongly. So she's paid a price, even though it hasn't cost her job necessarily, but it's a price she's been willing to pay. And you're 100% correct that she positioned herself so that she wouldn't need to depend on anyone. I think in part because of, as we discussed, her early upbringing and her early years made her realize that she couldn't depend on a husband or anyone to understand her and support her and encourage her. So she was just going to do it herself. And so she calculated that the best way would, rather than spend her life making more money so that she could buy enough land and save enough resources, and then maybe she could retire and do the work that she wanted when she was 50 or 60, she said, no, I'm going to look at the equation from the opposite direction and reduce my expenses and simplify my life so that I don't need much money, and then I don't need a job, and then I can do what I want by living pretty simply. And that's one reason she started eating roadkill, is that's free food along the side of the road. Even in Atlanta, she was eating roadkill. And so those kinds of calculations have guided her life, so that if she pares down her expenses and lives very marginally and simply, she has the freedom to do the things that she loves, and she doesn't have to wait until she retires. She can do that. She started doing that when she was in her mid-20s and continues to this day. So that freedom that she carved out for herself is a very difficult life. I mean, there are no hardware stores on Cumberland Island. There are no food. There's no stores, period, on Cumberland. So she has to hunt, gather, or scavenge everything she eats for the most part. So that's not an easy life, but it's the life that she loves, and it's made her the effective biologist. She walks the talk in a way that few other people do, and that gives her a credibility that is unmatched.
Yeah. I want to say we only have about 10 minutes left. So if you're in our Zoom chat and you have questions for Will, go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A little box, and we'll try to take some of those, because I could clearly ask questions all day, but we're only going to go another 10 minutes or so. And so my last question before we turn it over to the audience questions is, Carroll did accomplish so much, and it's so cool doing this particular book club too, the day after Earth Day, because it's a time where we really want to appreciate our environment and do a better job taking care of it. And so my question for you is sort of two-part, but it's like, how can we take small steps in our everyday life to be more like Carroll? And then sort of the part B is, it really surprised me at the end of the book too. You referenced it earlier, but then at the end you said one of Carroll's regrets was not having children, not experiencing, childbirth and being a mom. And I read her book and I'm like, oh, I want to be like Carroll, except I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. And so much of what she does and how hard her life is and what she commits herself to seems almost impossible with children in today's culture. And so if you could just maybe give us some tips to be more like Carroll, and then also, considering having children in this day and age, like what we can do in that respect as well.
Yes. No, I've talked with Carroll a lot about this question about children, and I've come to the conclusion, as hard and uncomfortable as it is that I don't think Carroll would have been quite as effective of a biologist had she had kids in her time. I think things have changed, but I think it may have limited her in a way, but I don't think that's true today. And I think you are a shining example. But even you have acknowledged the toll that adventure and outdoor experiences can have on a family when you're doing something for months at a time. It takes a toll, and so finding that balance makes it harder than ever. But I think Carroll wants to experience life to its fullest, and I think reproduction and child raising is an inherent part of the natural world and the human world, and that experience she missed out on. I think almost from an evolutionary standpoint, she felt like she missed that part of it. But she is, she's really proud of what she's accomplished, but not in a self-glorious way, but more in a legacy reflection. She lives on Cumberland Island, but she wants her house to be bulldozed. She has a small cabin that she built from driftwood that she dragged from the ocean. But she doesn't want her legacy, like her personal legacy, to be memorialized or anything, but she wants the island to remain a wild place. And she has almost single-handedly accomplished that. She's created a wilderness. It's not perfect, but it's still 8,000 acres that is recognized by the United Nations as a global biosphere reserve. No one else would have done that except for Carroll Ruckdeschel, and that's an amazing legacy. And still at age 78, she's still living on Cumberland Island. She lives through hurricanes and continues to wade into alligator nests or alligator dens, and she's still fierce and feisty as ever. And so I think we can't all be Carroll. I've been inspired and I've changed my life just being around her, but we can fight for the beautiful places, the wild places in our backyard. And that's what I've tried to do actually is I'm so inspired by Carroll's example that living here in the mountains, I realized I need to step up and do something for my Blue Ridge backyard. And so uh, I've been really active lately in trying to protect our national forests, which are undergoing a big 30-year management plan. And I've been amazed how the parallels between Carroll's experiences and my own, just in terms of dealing with federal agencies and pushback from different folks, so it's a fight that all of us can engage in. And we have wild places in all of our backyards that need voices. And now more than ever, there's so many crises coming at us, the coronavirus, the climate crisis. We're also experiencing an extinction crisis. And the species that have been on this earth for hundreds of millions of years could disappear in our lifetimes. And that's haunting to Carroll and to me as well. And I think we owe it to those creatures and to those legacies to at least give them a voice, to give them a fighting chance.
So a lot of people are asking here, like, how can we support Carroll's work? How can we support your work? And it seems like you're saying to get involved and get involved locally and in your backyard is a great way to continue this legacy. Someone else asked, this is really interesting to me because I was sitting in our living room reading your book and my husband was on the couch 5 feet away reading Where the Crawdads Sing. And someone asked if there's any connection between Carroll and Where the Crawdads Sing.
I've heard that a few times now. I don't know for sure if Carroll was an inspiration for that, but there certainly are a lot of parallels between those two characters, those two protagonists. That's such a beautifully written book. I don't think that Carroll necessarily needed to be a part of it, but the author is a biologist and may have heard of Carroll's story tangentially, and maybe that helped inspire her character. But yes, Carroll would love for you to fight for your backyard, but she also would love for you to visit Cumberland and fall in love with Cumberland and speak up for sea turtles and Cumberland Island, because it's still not saved. And that's the other lesson is, Carroll fought for 20, 30 years, got this to be, she helped with making it a wilderness. And that happened in the 80s. And we thought, okay, our work is done here. It's protected forever. And that's just not true. That conservation is constantly playing defense. And it's a vigilance that has to be ongoing, and it doesn't end with a designation. And so Carroll's 78 years old. We need some new folks to follow in her footsteps or to forge their own paths to protect Cumberland and other places, because she's not going to be around forever, and Cumberland needs voices like hers to step up.
And yeah, there are so many staggering facts in your book, and one of them is that 100,000 turtles, dolphins, and whales, I believe, die each year from ingesting plastics in our ocean. So I know our family, because again, Earth Day brings all these good feelings, and it also brings this guilt of like, oh, we're not doing enough. And so each Earth Day, our family's trying to decide on one step that we can make a habit in our everyday life that helps the environment. And this year, partly because of your book, we really talked about trying to reduce our use of plastic because of those staggering numbers. So it can feel overwhelming. I think that there is a lot we can do. I've been so inspired and motivated by your book, Will. I want to say thank you. A lot of our audience members are also asking what I would like to know, which is, do you have another book on the horizon? And it took 20 years for this one. So are you like a sea turtle where it takes you 30 years to come back to the same place? How long do we have to wait for another book by Will Harlan?
So there are two great questions there. Thank you for taking on the plastic problem, because that is something we can do individually and collectively. And Carroll, she's such a pioneer. Like, she's had a newsletter for 40 years. And in her first newsletters back in the 70s and 80s, she's talking about how much plastic she's seeing in the turtle guts, especially balloons, which you wouldn't think about, but people let balloons go, helium balloons, and then they almost always land in the ocean, and then sea turtles eat them because they look like jellyfish. And so that's one small step we've taken, is no more helium balloons. We're not going to release them for sure. But those kinds of little things add up. I mean, you don't release a helium balloon, that's one less sea turtle that's going to choke and die. It really does matter. And so those little steps, as small as they seem, are saving turtle lives. They're saving life. But yeah, I would love to take on another book. I haven't come across anyone quite like Carroll, but I'm definitely on the lookout. And yes, this one took me 19 years. I'm giving myself, a window, and also I'm pretty immersed in protecting our mountains right here, and also being a dad. This is my only chance to be a dad, and I want to make sure I do that well. I can write a book when I'm a grandpa, but if I find the right person and topic and story, I'd love to take on another book for sure. I learned so much from it, and it's been one of the most exciting experiences of my life, and to celebrate a woman like Carroll has been the best part. So last story, when I first came to Cumberland, like I said, I heard these whispers about this wicked witch, and Park Service, told all sorts of bad stories about her, and the public was afraid of her, and she knew that. She would go down to the ferry where people got off the boat, and would sense the whispers, and she heard what people were saying. And now when she goes down there, she's still a little guarded, but people walk up to her, and instead of whispering behind her back, they're coming up and shaking her hand and saying thank you, which she hasn't heard in 40 years of being out there. And I think that, to me, is the biggest success of the book, is that Carroll is finally getting the appreciation that she deserves.
Well, I definitely want to thank you. I want to thank Carroll for her vulnerability and trusting you, which I know must have been a huge weight and privilege. You've just done such a beautiful job of telling her story and sharing information about Cumberland and sea turtles and conservation. And it is just an awesome gift. And I know a lot of us right now, when we think about our backyards, and also because this book club is streaming on the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, this is a 2,200-mile trail that's in a lot of our backyards, and it's something that we can all get behind and protect the areas that touch the trail as well. I know Will has to go to another meeting. I want to mention that if you'd like a signed copy of Will's book, Untamed, we do offer it through our hiking company, which is Blue Ridge Hiking Company. So www.blueridgehikingco.com. You can get a signed copy of Untamed. And next week this is so fun. I love our book club. We have another just amazing story, and this is about a woman, Pharr Richardson Whiteley, who has struggled with eating disorders, binge and overeating disorders, for most of her life, and has been through personal trauma as well. And the outdoors has been very therapeutic in her journey to health and wellness, and her story includes climbing up Kilimanjaro at 300 pounds. And she talks a lot about what it means to be a hiker, and you don't have to look a certain way or have a certain background to appreciate and benefit from the outdoors. So I hope you'll join us next week with Cara. All our books are author signed and available at our store. And I hope you all take some time to appreciate your backyard, and then B, think about some ways to protect it and conserve it in the next week. So thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye, guys.
See you.